very happy to introduce Mr. Hans von Spakovsky. He's director of the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. That's the election law. He is an expert on that. He's also an attorney. He's an authority on civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment, and immigration, telling us all the ways that we can experience voter fraud. June the 2nd, we have a by-mail only primary election.
What's been happening over the past month and a half, 2 months really now, that since we've been in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, is there has been a push by liberals, by Democrats, to override all of the security protocols that states have in place when it comes to the handling of absentee ballots, and to push for us to have not just all-male primaries, but they are pushing to have an all-male election in November. Look, the basic problem with that is this. Look, everywhere in the country you can vote by absentee ballot, including, of course, in Maryland. 5 states actually have switched to all-male elections. Oregon was the first state to do that. But everywhere else, you can vote by absentee ballot. In many states, you don't need an excuse. In some states, like Texas, you do need an excuse. If you're sick or physically disabled, or you're not going to be able to be at the polling place, then you can vote by absentee ballot. So yeah, it's very clear we need them for people who can't make it to the polls. But the whole problem with absentee ballots is they are voted out of sight and outside the supervision of election officials. So if you look at the voter fraud cases that have occurred around the country, and as you probably know, we try to document those in a voter fraud database that we maintain at the Heritage Foundation. We just added about a half dozen cases. We're up to almost 1,300 proven cases from around the country. And this is just relatively recent cases. It's not a comprehensive list. Many of those are absentee ballot fraud cases because they are easier to steal. They are easier to pressure and intimidate voters to vote a particular way. And that's why you have to take a lot of precautions with them. Democrats are trying to override all of those precautions. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The bill that just got passed in the House on Friday, the bill that Nancy Pelosi proposed, it's her new big coronavirus bill, would make it illegal for any state to apply a voter ID requirement, a witness requirement, or a notarization requirement to any absentee ballot. Legalize vote harvesting all over the country and override state laws that ban vote harvesting like North Carolina has. For anybody who wonders, I know you've heard that term a lot, what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. Look, in every state where you vote by absentee ballot, after you complete the ballot as a voter, you can mail it back, you can hand deliver it yourself to election officials. In most states, a member of your family can hand deliver it. In some states like California, they have legalized vote harvesting, which means anyone can show up at your front door to pick up your ballot. Candidates themselves, people who work for campaign organizations, party activists, political consultants, and guns for hire can all show up at your front door and ask you for your ballot. Now, can you really trust they're going to deliver that ballot? You know, if they work for one particular political party and they know that you vote regularly for the others, are they really going to deliver your ballots? And if people like that can show up at your front door, how much pressure and intimidation is possibly going to occur to get you to vote a particular way? Anybody who doubts that that doesn't happen, I can cite you case after case after case in different places around the country where that has in fact occurred. Absentee ballots, while they are required, we should not be encouraging them, and we certainly don't want an all-male election. There's no need for it. How do we know that? Well, because other jurisdictions have conducted elections with in-person voting under much worse conditions. I just published a paper, it's available at the Heritage website, which all of you can find, that goes through and explains and outlines how Liberia held a nationwide election in 2014 in the midst of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. Ebola is a much more dangerous disease than COVID-19, and they did so successfully. How did they do it? Well, all of the kind of safety protocols that have put in place here in this country that allow us all to go to the grocery store, to go to Home Depot, to go to the drugstore, were all put in place. There was social distancing in the lines. There were sanitation stations set up outside and inside the polling booths. Disposable pens and other things were put out so that people could mark a ballot just once and then no one else would have to handle it. They were able to do it successfully. Similarly, Wisconsin was just able to successfully hold an election. They did their primary August 7th. Yes, a lot of people voted by mail, but over 300,000 individuals voted in person, and they had extensive training for their poll workers for everything that I just talked about. They even had, if you can believe this, curbside voting, so that you could drive up to a polling place, call the telephone number, an election worker would come out to your car. All you had to do was crack your window and they would slip a ballot inside a plastic sleeve. You filled out the ballot, put it back in the plastic sleeve, slipped it through the crack in the window of the election officials, and your vote was taken care of. There's just been a medical report released saying there's been no spike in COVID-19 infections in Wisconsin. I saw that NPR put out a report saying, oh, well, there were 79 infections because of the election. That's actually not true. If you look at the reports, what they say is Wisconsin health officials have now been asking people who have been found to be infected, did you vote on April 7th? And a small number have said yes. But the health officials then cautioned that they can't actually say that these people got the infection because they voted as opposed to somewhere else. And like I said, the reports indicate there's been no spike. So we can conduct an election if we want to, and there certainly is no reason to make the decision now when the election is not till November 3rd to have an all-male election. Is there anybody amongst your audience who thinks that we're still all going to be home on November 3rd? I don't think so. Many states are already opening up. In Virginia, where I live, most of the state has already opened up again, except for Northern Virginia, to my great annoyance, by the way. So in November, I think we're all going to be back at school, back at work, back going out, and there's no reason we can't be in our polling places to do that. Part of the CARE Act, remember the CARE Act was the bill that did get passed by Congress and signed by the president to deal with the coronavirus. Part of that bill appropriated $400 million that was given to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission for giving out to the states to deal with any and all extra costs they may incur directly holding their elections because of the virus. I actually made an inquiry today about that. Apparently, those funds have already been dispersed to the states.
Somebody, a viewer, is asking what the difference is between an absentee and a mail-in ballot.
There isn't a difference. People usually refer to absentee ballots are mailed to you by election officials, and normally they're mailed back. People use the terms interchangeably. What I think gets confusing is that, look, in 45 states, if you want an absentee ballot, you're going to have to request one from election officials. But in 5 states, including Washington State and Oregon, Hawaii also, they have switched to all mail elections. What that means is that in Oregon, for example, they simply mail an absentee ballot to every single registered voter, which of course is a big problem because all of you know that our voter registration rolls are in notoriously bad shape. And so when you are simply mailing out a ballot to every registered voter, it means that many ballots will arrive at the homes of registered voters when they don't live there anymore, or they've passed away. And the problem with vote harvesting is vote harvesters may come through that neighborhood trying to collect those ballots so they can vote them. So that's not a good idea to mail a ballot out to every registered voter, because it's going to make it easier to cheat in the election.
There are some exceptions to the mail-in ballot, is that some people can drop off their ballot at the polling places. And I believe that some people can actually vote there.
The way to raise hackles about this is the U.S. Justice Department Civil Rights Division, their voting section, they have an 800 number for complaints. And if I were you, I would find that. You could find it on the website of the Justice Department. Look for the voting section. And I would call them and complain and tell them that your county is acting in a discriminatory manner by where it's placing these polling locations and by limiting the number of polling locations that are open, and try to get the Justice Department to look into this. I can tell you, when lawyers from the Justice Department call local election officials, they stand up and take notice. A number of states have put in voter ID requirements: Georgia, Indiana, Texas, Alabama, Wisconsin, and others. In every single one of those cases, the state spent a lot of money and time having to fight in court against organizations, everything from the Democratic Party to the League of Women Voters, trying to get those ID laws in place. They've been overwhelmingly successful. They've lost in 1 or 2 states, but in most of the states they've won, and those laws have been in place now for more than a decade. Unfortunately, Virginia, the legislature just recently voided its voter ID law. That law was passed a few years ago by the Republican-controlled legislature. It survived a court challenge, but unfortunately with the Democratic takeover of Virginia, they just got rid of the voter ID requirement. Here's 2 things about it. One, look, it's something that's needed. It's not the only kind of security protocol that's needed. There are many others that are there, but it's just a basic requirement that ought to be applied to both in-person voting and absentee balloting. And after 10 years of these ID laws being in place in states like Georgia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spakovsky, for coming. I'd like to ask you if you have any idea about the validity of Maryland's voter registration rolls. How many might be deceased or moved or ineligible to vote that are still reflected on our voter registration rolls?
There's a project underway right now being conducted by the Public Interest Legal Foundation. They've obtained voter registration lists from a number of states, and they are actually going through and doing a very careful, very painstaking checking of those rolls, something, frankly, that the state ought to be doing. I don't think they've released their report yet on Maryland, but I know that they are working on it. There's all kinds of instances of it in our database, and it involves everything from illegal vote harvesting of the kind that occurred in North Carolina in 2018. Remember, in the congressional elections of 2018, there was only one contested race in the entire country. That was in North Carolina's 9th congressional district. And a vote harvester there was charged with several felonies because it turned out that, and the election was overturned, by the way, because he and his staff were going to people's homes and collecting their absentee ballots. And the evidence showed that in some cases they just collected empty ones, forged signatures, and filled them out. In other cases, they changed the choices of the voter. And in some instances, it looks like they didn't deliver the ballots of the vote they'd been given by the voters. Folks suspect because they knew that those particular voters were not voting for their candidate. I mean, that's a recent case. We just added another case to our database of a mayor removed from his post in Gordon, Alabama, for engaging in absentee ballot fraud in an election that he won by only 16 votes. And like I said, there are cases like that from all over the country, including in places like Indiana and Texas, Virginia too. It's difficult with mail-in ballots, and that's one of the problems with them, and one of the reasons that I always go in person to vote. By the way, I should mention for everybody, all these officials are saying, oh my gosh, you just can't do an election in person. I just voted in person in Virginia. I live in Vienna, Virginia. We just had a town council and mayoral election, and the polling place in town was open. And they had more precautions in place at the polling place than I see when I go to my local grocery store to shop for groceries. And there were no crowds, there was social distancing, everything was done exactly the way it's been recommended, and there was no problem in getting in, casting my ballot, and getting out. Oh, by the way, let me just give you a number, because this tells you the problems with mail-in elections and basically handing over our elections to the U.S. Postal Service. Every 2 years, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission files a report with Congress on the data they've collected from the states about the last federal election. According to that report, in 2016, if you all recall, Hillary Clinton got 2.9 million more votes in the national popular vote than Donald Trump. There were 6.5 million mail-in or absentee ballots reported by the states that were misdirected or unaccounted for. Misdirected means they were either sent to the wrong address by election officials, or the Postal Service sent them back saying no such registered voter lives at this address. They also, the states and the EAC report has an unknown category or unaccounted for. What that means is election officials mailed an absentee ballot to a voter. You know, a voter requested a ballot, so they mailed it to the voter, and then they never heard anything more about that ballot. Now, it's very possible the ballot arrived at the voter's home and he or she decided, well, I'm really not interested in voting, and they threw out the ballot. But we don't really know. All we do know, or all the states know, is they mailed a ballot to a voter and they don't know what happened to it.
Wow.
That's 2.9 million versus 6.5 million. So for every vote that Hillary Clinton got more than Donald Trump, there are two votes that, two absentee ballots that we really can't account for. A very liberal media group that's always doing attack pieces on me. And so a liberal group published a story saying, oh, we're being inaccurate about that. When we talk about unaccounted for ballot, they said, oh, that's just not true, said some liberal professor. Those ballots are probably all in a landfill somewhere. Well, I guess being in a landfill somewhere to me still means they're unaccounted for. But apparently that he thought that made it okay.
Hans, I know that in many states, if an election seems to be totally resolved, they don't even count all the absentee ballots. So I've always wondered, when Trump supposedly lost by so many votes, how many absentee ballots around the country don't ever even get counted?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how big that is. The same thing used to happen with provisional ballots. I assume everybody knows what a provisional ballot is. If you show up at a polling place to vote and you're not on the registered voter list, or there's some other problem that wouldn't normally allow you to vote, under federal law passed in 2002, election officials have to offer you what's called a provisional ballot. You complete the ballot and you fill out other information about who you are and your eligibility and all that. And after election day is over, election officials have to investigate the case and see whether or not your ballot should be counted. And the typical example of a provisional ballot is somebody who comes in and they're not on the registered voter list. And the voter says, well, I should be registered. I registered when I went to DMV and got my driver's license. So what election officials will do is they'll investigate to see if that's really true. And if in fact that is true and the mistake was made by government officials, DMV failed to forward your voter registration information to election officials, well, then they'll say, yeah, you get to vote and your vote will be counted. If it turns out that's not true, you didn't actually try to register to vote, then it won't get counted. Well, Los Angeles used to not even look at the provisional ballots and investigate whether they should be counted back before this federal law was passed if the margin of victory was much larger than the number of provisional ballots. In other words, if the provisional ballots, even if you decide to count all of them, wouldn't make a difference in the election, they wouldn't even look at it. They can't do that anymore. Under that federal law, election officials have to investigate and make a decision on every provisional ballot as to whether it will be counted or not, and they have to notify the voter whether or not their ballot got counted.
Is that also true for the absentee ballots? For example, there's always been a problem with military ballots not getting back in time. Do they have to count them under the law?
They don't have to count. They don't have to count ballots that don't make it back in time for a deadline. I'm not aware of a federal law regarding the counting of absentee ballots in a situation where they won't make a difference. I think that's going to be dependent on state law, and I don't know what the state law, for example, is in Maryland about that.
Is as important as voter ID is, it really doesn't solve the problem if we don't have judges from both parties. And a huge problem that we have as Republicans is getting judges in urban areas. And the Democrats in Maryland will just get somebody who is a Democrat to be the quote Republican judge. Maybe they change their party affiliation. Maybe they don't even do that anymore. So you don't really have any way to know that the voter ID would make any difference if you don't have that protection.
You've got to get people into the polls to work as poll workers or election judges, as that term is often used. Because if there's nobody in the polls who can make sure that the law is being followed, for example, when you have a voter ID law, well, then the law isn't any good. And yeah, that's always been a problem, is getting enough people to do that kind of work.